Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Rosen. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro University. And welcome to the FOLCS Conversation Series. Tonight's guest, my old friend, Jonathan Rosen, and his newest book, which has been receiving raves, well-deserved. We're going to get into it. It's a fascinating story. The Best Minds, the story of friendship, madness, and the tragedy of good intentions. Now, let me tell you, everyone, here it is. This is your summer read. This is your summer book. And I'll tell you why. It's because this book is many things. It's many kinds of books. And you'll be able to read a number of different things in one book all summer. For instance, it's about this tragic murder that took place 25 years ago that did grip the nation, but perhaps has been forgotten, about Michael Lauder, who was a Yale Law School graduate who had suffered from schizophrenia and mental illness. A movie was being made about his life by Ron Howard, and he had a book deal, which he had not yet fulfilled. And it was all about how he had overcome against impossible odds, his illness. And then this horrible thing happened. He had a delusion, and he thought that his fiancée, pregnant with his child, was a robot or a wind-up doll, and he stabbed her to death. And he is still institutionalized 25 years later. Guess what? That movie never got made because it had a horrible Hollywood ending. And you know what movie did get made instead by the same director? A Beautiful Mind, which is an incredible irony that we'll talk about. The movie was originally the Michael Lauder film, not The Beautiful Mind, was at first supposed to be Michael was going to be portrayed by Leonardo DiCaprio. Then the project went over to Brad Pitt, and that movie never got made. You never got a chance to see that, but instead you saw A Beautiful Mind. This story took place 25 years ago, and let me tell you why Jonathan wrote about this. Michael Lauder, who committed this crime, was Jonathan Rosen's best childhood friend from when he was 10 years old. They grew up together. They went to school together every day. They were almost brotherly in affection. They were competitors. They both went to Yale College, and they both wanted to be novelists, fiction writers. They had this incredible commonality, and Jonathan explores this story 25 years later and includes himself as part of the story because Jonathan, aside from Michael Lauder's own brothers, no one knew Michael Lauder better than Jonathan Rosen. But the book has more to it than that. It's about childhood friendships and brotherly competition and the loyalties of a tight-knit community, whether it's Yale Law School or psychoanalysts, psychiatrists that lived in New Rochelle where they grew up. It is about mental illness, of course. It's also about the public policy about what to do with mental illness, because many people know, live in New York, it's either school shootings or subway murders. We're seeing more and time again, it's committed by people that have mental illnesses, brain diseases, and we just haven't quite figured out what to do about this. And so this is not just about mental illness, but about public policy surrounding mental illness. Guess what? The book is also a thriller. It's written in a style that it really, even though you know what's going to happen, it's written in a style that you're just waiting for it. And you're in the hands of a master, because Jonathan is himself a recognized award-winning novelist. And in so many ways, this book is also about him. It's a literary memoir by a professional storyteller telling you his story in connection with this tragic story that took place 25 years ago from his best childhood friend. As I said, Jonathan is a recognized novelist. In fact, I know this. I reviewed his first novel, Eve's Apple, for the Wall Street Journal. He also wrote Joy Comes in the Morning. He's also written nonfiction books. The Talmud and the Internet was also award-winning. He's written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic. Please welcome my friend, Jonathan Rosen. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Thane, and thank you for that overwhelming introduction.
Well, it's well-deserved, my friend. This book is really quite a remarkable achievement, and I don't say this all the time. If you want to buy the book, the link is in the chat box, and by the end of this hour, I assure you, you'll probably want to buy the book. If you're watching us live on YouTube, welcome. We always love having you. make sure you come to folks.org to sign up for our email list. You'll get more information about upcoming events. And if you have a question for Jonathan, you can leave it in the Q&A box. Hopefully we'll get some time for that. So Jonathan, it does feel to me when you read this book, it's so extremely well written, so emotionally complex, so psychologically complex, that there is a bit of unfinished business here for you. That there's a reason. It's not just the anniversary of the killing of Michael's fiancée, Carrie Costello, but that you yourself felt that you needed to go back and think about your childhood and think about your connection to Michael Lauder. Is there any truth to that, that there was a compulsion for you to get to the story that you had never touched upon before? By the way, Jonathan, I've known you a long time. I never heard you talk about this.
Well, I wouldn't say that I was avoiding talking about it, but I was avoiding writing about it. I spent many years not writing about it before I spent many years writing it. And it was never really even clear to me what I was avoiding and what I would be writing if I were to be writing. And in a sense, the book begins 50 years ago when I moved to New Rochelle. And I realized that in order to write it, I didn't want to write it backwards. Michael was on the cover of the New York Post under a massive headline that said psycho. If I had only seen that cover, I would not have thought at all about him or understood him. If I had only seen the article the New York Times published 3 years before that, when he was jauntily leaning against a column at Yale Law School, and it described him as by all accounts a genius, I wouldn't have understood him either. Frankly, those are the two poles of public discourse in a way.
And that's why you went backwards to the beginning.
And I went backwards. I also didn't want it to seem only like a tragic inevitability, because many choices were made along the way. Interestingly, painfully, one of his mentors, and he had extraordinary mentors at Yale Law School, a couple of them had clerked for judges who had changed the laws regarding institutionalization when they were young, so in the 50s and 60s. So for them, what happened was a reckoning as well. And when I spoke to them, I felt them reckoning with this story. But
just to be clear, so the audience sees what you're saying, that these law professors worked on cases that dealt with mental illness and what we do with the mentally ill. And the reckoning that you're talking about is that many people ended up being taken out of psychiatric institutions and back into society. And the outcome for that isn't just the tragic death of Carrie Costello, but as I said earlier, things that we're seeing in the broader culture of mass shootings, school shootings, subway murders, that the reckoning is that we're coming to terms with some of those decisions. Is that what you're saying?
Some of the actual policy decisions, but before there were policy decisions, there was an almost romantic understanding about what mental illness was. And it was very painful and moving to discover that several of those professors, despite the fact that they had as clerks written decisions, for judges that really changed the laws, but they didn't know anything about severe mental illness. For them, it was an extension of the civil rights movement. And in a way, that's a very complicated analogy, because people who have severe mental illness should be treated with dignity and respect, but they are not the same as people who are discriminated against because of the color of their skin. And They viewed asylums almost as ghettos whose walls had to come down.
But here's the paradox there, Jonathan. They finally met someone, one of their prize students, Michael Lauder. And what they saw in their classroom also didn't quite reveal to them what could happen to someone with schizophrenia. In other words, they didn't imagine that one of their students was a murderer.
No, and he wasn't a murderer in the sense that ultimately, even when he stabbed to death the person he loved most in the world, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity because he could not tell the difference between what was real and what was not real. But what was interesting is the degree to which they never really credited that condition or that state.
I see.
but it's complex in many ways because they saw him as brilliant. It was a shock for me to discover that he couldn't really do the work. And so brilliance, which had always been how people talked about Michael, was a category separate from almost competence. And that's its own strange element. But
And that's what good intentions means in the book title, right? In part.
it's what good intentions and what the tragedy of good intentions means.
Right. Because he was helped along.
And one of his professors said to me afterwards, he said, I think it was a tragic inevitability. And in a way, I thought that that was not true. I didn't want to write this story as if it was a tragic inevitability. I wanted to go back to the time when we were just two 10-year-old kids who lived on the same street. I mean, the book's divided into 4 houses. First house is the house on Maryland Road. That's the house I grew up in. And it's also the house Michael grew up in. We shared a very short street. The second house is the house of law. And there really was a grand mansion that the psychiatrists who were architects of community psychiatry lived in.
That, right.
And there really was a house of law. I mean, because it was Yale Law School, and a house of psychiatry, and then a house of dreams, which is movies. Yeah. But the containers, like those are leaky containers. And so even in our childhood, our house on Maryland Road contained all of these possibilities where we dreamed about being a writer. Being smart was enormously important. Why? I was one of the problems or questions I asked myself. Why was it so important that we consider ourselves brilliant, as if that would exempt you from all the sorrows of the world?
Well, but the title, it gives away some of that, The Best Minds. It's a very evocative title because it had multiple meanings. Brainy, bookish Jewish boys who are tall, but don't want to play in the NBA. That's not what they're interested in. They're interested in writing books, particularly fiction. It's an unusual sharing of an interest for 10-year-olds that they wanted to be authors. Both of your fathers were college professors, right? He was the perfect playmate, as Cynthia Ozick had described. But at the same time, and there is this book, the book is almost a Valentine to the human brain. It evokes the idea that it leads to human progress and a ticket to upward mobility, a ticket to, a gateway to happiness, as if this is sort of the dream of the next, the Jewish immigrant families that you grew up with. But at the same time, the book is also about the failure of the human mind, right? It seems to have both, that you have the celebration of the mind, and then at some point, the breakdown of the mind.
And I think the best minds, although it's a line from Allen Ginsberg poem, Howl, is also the experts, the intellectual elites who considered themselves the best minds. One of the epigraphs, every chapter has an epigraph, quotes Kingman Brewster, who was the president of Yale, talking in the 60s about urban renewal. And what he said was, we need to be our brother's thinkers. Yale was untouched. Its beautiful buildings remained intact, but New Haven was a third plowed under because of this grand dream they had. Right.
So you said brothers. Here's something from the book. You say, what was the connection between the smart, gentle, bookish boy I had known and the man who had murdered his pregnant fiancée? And what was the connection between that man and me? It's a great sentence and line because you did have a symbiotic relationship with him. You were so much alike. Was there, in the aftermath, he had one mental breakdown in his 20s, and then yet another one in his 30s before this tragedy. It seems like your book is also introducing the idea that, yes, it's a genetic disease, but for the grace of God, go I. That you wonder, how do I avoid this? You even mention in the book, it's not contagious, but if it was, you would have had it. But it seems like clearly the last 25 years, as a novelist, you must have been contemplating, this could have been my story too.
I think it was a terror I had at the time, because although we seemed, as you quoted Cynthia Ozick saying to me in a letter about him, he was the ideal playmate, and that my parents had literally moved to the neighborhood so I could meet someone like Michael. um, we were very different. Michael was brilliant. He was he had a photographic memory. He read at blistering speed. In
He said
fifth
he
grade,
would literally be reading paperbacks in school when things were going on. He was blowing through them, right?
yes, he also read them all at the same time, which is unusual. He had stacks of books and he would open one. I mean, it was like a chain smoker lighting one book with the, ashes of the previous one, but he wouldn't finish one and then read the next one. He would just open them up, and his fifth grade teacher confirmed all this for me. But he did that because he'd read all the levels of the SRAs, these extremely boring reading material that we had. But I, though I didn't know it at the time, am dyslexic. I'm an incredibly slow reader. And so Michael's mind was all overtness. He could recite whole passages from a book he had just read. Whereas I was always afraid. I always had a sense of concealment, that I was simultaneously bound up with this high literary calling, but actually I read with such slowness that I always felt there was something wrong with my mind. And my bar mitzvah, which I write about, is a great debacle, which it was. I forgot everything, having committed it to memory without any comprehension, whereas he could have memorized mine as well as his. And so, in a sense, he was a touchstone of high mental functioning for me. And that made me invest something in him, I think. I measured myself against him, but I also kind of counted on a certain reliable aspect of his mind. I mean, we were very competitive. It wasn't always nice, but it was simply a given for me. And so this kid who lived across the street from me, again, we always seemed like we were the same, and everything always turned out to be different. His father was a professor and my father was a professor. His father was professor of economics, born in Brooklyn. He wore a leather bomber jacket. He combed his hair back. He was always pronouncing opinions at high decibel. My father's parents were killed in the Holocaust. My father liked to sit on the aisle. He didn't like anyone in uniform, including police officers. I describe sometimes Michael and I would see our fathers talking, and my father would be walking backwards and Chuck, his father, would be walking forwards. And I had a sister, and Michael had two brothers. He was the youngest. In my family, when I played Monopoly with my sister, she would let me buy the colors I liked. I would let her buy the colors she liked. Michael's family, there were these big brothers, and if you didn't write your name on something, it would disappear. And someone was always yelling, who ate my, who drank my Dr. Pepper? And I loved it because it had this kind of, I guess, aggressive energy that I never encountered in other places. I wouldn't have wanted to live there. It was loud, chaotic. It was like a Darwinian scrimmage. But in any case, our fathers were professors, but of a very different kind. Michael's father was all forward movement. I envied his having been, we were both born in America. I almost said his having been born in America, as if I'd inherited some provisional, tentative foothold, something I think you probably understand, Thane, because you yourself are a child of survivors, and you understand what that's like. You absorb not some epigenetic information, but simply an accurate sense that I was named for someone who was murdered. Right. And so, and at the same time, despite all the differences and despite this anomalousness of the situation, I mean, Michael, in addition to being brilliant, which wasn't an ordinary thing, killed someone. But I kept discovering in the 10 years I spent writing the book that he lived on everyone's street in some strange way. So many people said to me, the woman who was head of NAMI, which is the organization of support for families or people themselves who have mental illness, said to me he was everyone's child. Ellen Sachs, someone who became everything Michael was going to be. She went to Yale Law School with schizophrenia, although no one knew at the time. She won a MacArthur Award. She wrote a best-selling memoir. She's a professor of law. She wrote about Michael. When I was reading her memoir, there was Michael in the back of her book.
He had that impact on people. But I want, before to get back to something you just said about the two fathers being different. And yet, one of Michael's delusions was that his parents were hijacked, essentially. The people he were living with were actually Nazis. right? He didn't come from a world of the Holocaust like you. And yet he believed at some point that the Nazis had invaded the bodies of his parents, and he threatened to kill his parents because he believed they were imposters. He went to the attic to try to search for the bodies of his parents.
Yeah.
And when you visited him in the mental institution at Columbia Presbyterian and at the locked ward, I think he said to you at some point, he was afraid that one of the doctors was either Joseph Mengele or somebody who was trying to pull out a portion of his brain. So that to me is, yes, he was not a child of immigrants. And yes, the two of you were very different. But even the delusions to me were very interesting, that they were somehow, they didn't arise from your friendship with Jonathan Rosen, but he knew that world. And that perhaps in his own psychotic way, his deepest, darkest delusions also reflected the nightmares of Robert Rosen, your dad.
Well, what's interesting about that it's absolutely true. I mean, I often thought how ironic it was in a way, because he also thought he was being pursued by Nazis. They were driving him off the streets. Whereas, if you grow up in a house like mine, that's just another day at the office, imaginatively. But, you're always preparing and wondering. But in a much larger way, not to leap to the macrocosm, but what I kept discovering is how much the Holocaust shadowed post-war America. It changed psychiatry. It changed the way people saw institutions. The first pictures smuggled out of state hospitals by conscientious objectors doing alternate service in very understaffed state hospitals because half of the staff had been drafted. They were mostly Quakers and Mennonites. They discovered this horrifying scene of naked bodies crammed together. Those pictures were run by Life magazine just the way they ran pictures of liberated camps. Irving Goffman, who wrote an enormously influential book called Asylums, published in like 1961, is a sociologist. He likened state hospitals and to concentration camps, to total institutions.
Right.
The Milgram test, where they asked people to shock someone, was conducted in the basement at Lindsley Chittenden Hall at Yale, which was housed the English department when I was there. Milgram had written, if I was living in Europe, I would have been killed. And he was essentially doing a test to find hidden Eichmanns. It was inspired during the Eichmann trial. And this had a tremendously distorting influence, but everyone, it turns out, in some complex way was affected, and it had real consequences for how, because in a way, barracks are barracks. Concentration camps were horrific, but they were horrific for very specific reasons.
So I want to get to this other idea, because I have a novelist who wrote this book, which makes this even more interesting. And it's not only a novelist who wrote this book, but it's a novelist who's written Eve's Apple and other works, who picks up on the idea, like Kafka, that illness is very alluring. Thomas Mann knows this, Franz Kafka knows this from The Hunger Artist. You and I come from a very similar world. Eve's Apple, if you haven't read Eve's Apple, Jonathan's first novel, it's a terrific novel that you think is about anorexia, but it's not. It's not. It's really about illness and the allure of it. And so here's Jonathan Rosen yet again, many years later, with a real story this time. And I just want to talk to you about, as speaking as a novelist and the author of this book, because there is something about madness that is very alluring. I remember, you may remember this, you mentioned the movie Shine in the book several times. And you may remember the first thing I ever did for the New York Times, I wrote about Shine. And I remember I talked to the director, and I said to him, you seem to be all over the map about what caused this concert prodigy to have a mental breakdown and exhibit the signs of schizophrenia. And so in the movie, it's like, if you've seen the movie, the audience, it looks like it was brought about by playing the Rachmaninoff 5, that playing the music did it. And it also, there's a thought that his father, who was a Holocaust survivor, may have abused him. But so I said to him, I said, you think that he got schizophrenia from playing music, right? And he said, I'll never forget this, and I think I quoted, he said, there is something irresistible for the artist to think that someone goes too far and can't come back. That genius takes you so far and you can't actually return. And what I remember most about it is that Helfgott, the pianist's sister, lived in Israel. And I interviewed her, and she said, you're going to love this if you didn't remember it. She said, because this is true of Michael, this is ridiculous. My mother's family had schizophrenia. This is a genetic illness that ran in my family. This has nothing to do with music. This has nothing to do with the Holocaust. It happens to do with genetic sickness. So maybe this is something you've explored in so many different ways, that madness itself, sickness itself is alluring. And it's, I think, one of the reasons people will be drawn to this book.
It's alluring. It's also useful in a terrible way, because the one group of people that never helps are the people afflicted by it. But the asylum was treated like the central bank. You could borrow any metaphor from it. And even to start with Freud, who didn't treat people with severe mental illness, but who bestowed on everyone the concept of the psychopathology of everyday life. So everyday life became defined as a form of illness. It was a great gift to psychiatrists, because if you could, if everyone is ill, suffering from the psychopathology of everyday life, then you can heal the well, which is a lot easier
also, right?
Than, yes, and you can have an office like a chiropractor or a dentist and have normal hours, instead of being an alienist presiding over a huge hospital filled with people who have an illness for which in the 50s, until the 50s, there was nothing. There are no cures, but there weren't even antipsychotic drugs. And so the other thing about that that's so strange is that although Freud didn't work with people with psychosis, he believed everyone was made sick for the same reason. And so in a sense, if you had it a little bit, you would be neurotic. A lot, you would be psychotic. And that meant that when they released people from state hospitals, instead of creating what was promised, community centers to care for the severely ill, they called them community mental health centers. And we still live in a world that has redefined mental illness, first of all, simply as a big, fungible, generic term that everyone suffers from at one time or another. And it's not to diminish the pain of people's mental suffering, but there are a handful of severe illnesses where you are truly afflicted. So those things.
And that is what Michael had.
Yes, he had.
That's the point. But what we're saying is Michael, as you said, he had, like a physical ailment, he had a brain disease.
That's right. But it seemed almost, to some people, a kind of, as if there were a sort of glamour to it in a way. And that was also very complicated. I mean, so that's what.
I'm sorry, but please get to this point too. Didn't it also infect universities with literary theory? That
Yes.
It's not just Freud and the psychoanalytic community that decided to open up shops. And so that even Woody Allen movies joked about everybody being in therapy and everyone's in therapy. So it became part of the culture in the 70s. Of course, everyone has a therapist and everyone's neurotic and everyone has to go be treated by.
And if everyone is ill, nobody is ill.
Right, exactly. So, but also universities also helped to glorify
the universities and the culture itself. I mean, one of the things I say is that antipsychotic medication, which was finally discovered accidentally, like most psychiatric medication, was made available in like 1954. That was the same year LSD was also made available to psychiatrists. And, in one hand, you had a drug for suppressing delusions and hallucinations. And on the other hand, you had a drug for inducing them. And the one that induced them was called mind expanding. And if that is how we evaluate broadened consciousness, heightened awareness, then who on earth would wish to take something that suppressed delusions? When Aldous Huxley takes mescaline and writes, the doors of perception.
Yeah.
He's given a little bit by a psychiatrist who's been using mescaline, he thinks, to teach students of psychiatry what it feels like to be delusional. And Huxley writes that his trip, his hallucinations were like the best parts of schizophrenia, as if there were, good parts and bad parts. And so, and that kept happening. And then when I was a graduate student in English literature in the 80s, for some reason, you couldn't be a student of literature without reading Foucault, and you had to read Madness and Civilization. And Foucault was essentially arraying himself against the Enlightenment, the age of reason. And what is the opposite of reason? It's unreason. It's madness, as if it's the universal solvent that will open all the locks and the gates. But it's more than that. He has a conspiracy theory that madness and asylums were invented by the Enlightenment, and that the only reason anyone is ever deemed ill and put in an asylum is because they're different. And it's the way the state and power others you, demonizes you, and locks you away. And so if that is the case, and there is no other, it's only about power, then there is no illness. There is only a socially constructed idea of illness. And again, how on earth could that help someone who requires medication and who may, like Michael, at certain times be so sick, he doesn't think he's sick, and indeed thinks those people trying to help him are trying to kill him, are Nazis. And it's an inversion of the order of the world, is what it is.
And dilutes the significance, the magnitude of illness, right? It basically says to Michael, you're really just like everyone else. And if they're not, these are people that also would like to, they would like some of the delusions that you have, that everybody would almost like, envy the delusions you're having. And I want to go back to this, speaking to Jonathan Rosen, the novelist, the two of you wanted to be fiction writers, and the novelist reimagines a world, and the person who's suffering from mental illness, if they're schizophrenic, is suffering from delusions which are also imaginary. And I wonder whether in writing this, there's such a strange connection between the alchemy of the artist, and maybe that's why there's such an allure from the artistic community, right? And we know this. We hear, Vincent van Gogh. We're constantly being told about the relationship between madness and genius, right? So that it's not a surprise that we hear, oh yes, of course, Michael Lauder was often referred to as a genius. Of course, he was also mad. He was also had mental illness, as if, again, it romanticizes it, as if to say, delusions and the imagination emanate from the same portion of the brain. So what's really the difference between a novelist and someone who's suffering from psycho problems?
Well, it's interesting. When my mother used to tell me this story, and my mother's a writer, that when James Joyce, whose daughter was diagnosed with schizophrenia, consulted Jung, he said to Jung, as any father might, I also use words in creative ways and novel ways, and almost, he didn't use the term word salad, but that is that term of just almost musical association rather than sense. And Jung said to Joyce, you are diving to the bottom of a river and she is sinking.
Wow.
But in a way, having heard that story from my mother,
but when I just ask you something, are you saying, because you said something earlier, does that mean Jung understood this in ways that Freud didn't?
I don't know, because Jung actually also thought Joyce was mentally ill, but he may have understood that. But I don't really know. But I don't think but he also. But
it seems like he understood the gravity of what the child is suffering from versus what the novelist says. Well, this is sort of what I do anyway, and saying, believe me, you don't do what she does.
But I guess another strange element is, like our both wanting to be writers, is that in my house growing up, literature was kind of how you tested reality. If reality conformed to fiction, it was real. You reality tested in reverse.
Yeah.
Even when my mother, who died in her late 90s, had forgotten many things. When I would help her out of a taxi and into a wheelchair, she would say, "Punch me up, Judy," which is something Mr. Smallweed says in Bleak House.
Exactly.
And it was almost, and you could see even that it was just a sense of rightness restored. Literature validated and had formulated this experience. But what I wanted to say is that was so strange in the course of my writing the book and researching it, is that literature had been stolen and turned into medicine. I mean, the idea, Freud's idea that, a Greek myth makes you ill, and that somehow organizing your story will make you well, made perfect sense to a whole generation of literature-loving intellectuals, as if only, and I, there's that sense when you read a novel, if there's a first-person narrator, you think, well, everything is going to be okay. But I remember feeling very cheated. It was a Faulkner novel. Maybe it was Light in August, where somehow you're in the thoughts of a character, but he's horribly killed. And you feel, I don't understand. He was telling the story.
Telling the story.
And the only other person, another case in which there's a set of false expectations about what stories can do is pointed out by Lawrence Langer, who wrote a book about Holocaust testimonies. He studied the testimonies of the Yale Video Archives.
Yeah.
And one of the things he says is family members will often urge someone who has survived to tell the story. Oh, tell the story. And when they do, the expectation is it will bring relief, and it does not. Yeah. In fact, it brings hatred of themselves or shame or agony. And it's not just remembered pain. It's because maybe they've done things that they loathe. And it's the idea that a story would bestow relief or order the world in a way that somehow saves you from it is something, again, I grew up with and had to unlearn. And I had to keep untelling stories. The New York Times, when they wrote their laudatory, no pun intended, profile of Michael, they allowed him to dictate the terms of the story. And you can feel them eliding all the hard questions. Can we actually
talk a little about that? I'm jumping a gun.
Yes. No, I'm sorry. But all I meant to say was just that everybody was using this idea that if you formulate something, perhaps reality will follow. And we live in an age where that is very much true.
I want to come back to that. And I don't want to do it now. I'm going to definitely come back to what you just said about the New York Times profile in the way they let him dictate the terms of the story. I just want to give you another anecdote that you can take on the road with you, which was the same discovery that Langer saw was also discovered in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which believed the premise is that we can only reconcile if we can tell the truth of what happened, and we need to incentivize victims to tell everyone what happened to them. And what they didn't count on is you can't let someone testify for 8 hours about horrors and then send them home without a mental health professional. You can't expect them to feel relieved from that. If anything, they're going to walk away with much greater pain, grief, loss, and mourning. And that was a discovery that they never anticipated. It was all based on, isn't it just better, instead of punishing people, just let the story come out and the truths come out?
But one of the things, I just want to say, one of the things I'm ashamed about now is I realized that Michael was going to be telling his story. And I didn't stop to think, he can't, that's not his story. It's not something you conquer, and it's not a narrative. And I only just thought, wow, he got all this money. He's going to tell his story, and he had a hardship, but then he'll tell overcoming it. That was always the formula, in a sense. And everyone thought, I believe, that Hollywood was going to make his movie. So it was going to have a happy ending. One of his professors said to me at the end, don't blame Hollywood. He said, if Hollywood's to blame, we all are. Meaning Hollywood's in the business of happy endings. What business did Yale Law School have imagining the story different from how it was? That I've leapt ahead again because I can't stay in one house, but if you know what I mean. But there it is, because I myself always grew up imagining that it would be not something you do in the writing isn't something you do out of the fullness of your experience, but something you do that almost spares you from it. And that's an unwholesome way of thinking altogether.
So let me just, before we get to something else, since we're already in this subject, something you intimated before, and this Yale law professor said it as well. about Michael telling the story in the New York Times, or Michael having a chance to tell a story either through the book or the movie, which was something that comes up a couple times in the book that is very profound. And I want to make sure people know this is happening, because it's very important. It's where you read Michael's quotes, where he talks about why, speaking as an advocate for people with schizophrenia, to say that the stigma of people suffering from this disease, that they're violent, is a stigma and it's wrong, and that I myself am not violent. And you actually, in several parts of the book, are taken aback by that, because you actually know that's not exactly true. It's a nice way to tell the story, Michael, but there were intimations that there was violence, in the same way that you said the professor said, look at the hubris that we had at Yale Law School to overlook this man's disease and do everything possible with a feel-good ending that this is all going to work out great. And we can congratulate ourselves as Yale Law School. We can congratulate ourselves for what we did. And now we have to look back 25 years and say, yeah, but look what happened from that sickness. Look at what was taken away. And I want to get back to that, because you noted that as if to say, wait a minute, Michael, that's not true. Don't tell the New York Times that you're not violent. You could be.
Well, it was very specific. And of course, I was reading it very carefully. And he had been told not to tell anyone that he had schizophrenia when he was applying for law school. He wanted to be a law professor. And he didn't the first time around, but he hadn't done the things you need to do to get hired. So he hadn't,
clerk for a federal judge, right.
Right. And he'd had only a very brief, disastrous summer at a law firm. And so then he, as he said, came out in as a flaming schizophrenic, is how he put it in the Times. And it was very courageous. But then he spoke to the reporter about how he was asked because he described himself as having paranoid schizophrenia, if he was ever violent. And he simply said to the reporter that it's a very hurtful stereotype. And it is a very hurtful stereotype, but I knew that when Michael had been hospitalized, as you mentioned, he thought his parents were replicas, identical replicas, Nazi replicas of his actual parents. And so he had armed himself with a kitchen knife. And to say the question of violence, it's simply, he did not know what was real and he was defending himself. Or arming himself in case he was attacked. But that is already a very different place to be in. And his mother, right, who was terrified, and what I kept remembering was the terror his parents felt, and how my mother, who communicated it to me also because she talked to his mother, how it's like a horror movie where you close the door, you lock it behind you, and it's his horror movie. People he loved, who raised him, are monsters, and it's reciprocal fear as well. And so it's simply, it was an unchallenged thing. And so he spoke it away, and it was not a service to him. In the same way, he would report his delusions to his professors, and he didn't report all of them, but he would tell them a story. It was a very heroic story. And that when he woke up, his bed was on fire and his father would talk him through the flames, but they would tell each other that story, and they all told it to me. Now, whether many other things happened, or that was just the story that served for all the others. At one point, he told the dean, this morning, I thought my bed was on fire, and I thought you were the devil. And when the dean reported this to his daughter, who was training to be a psychiatrist and working with mentally ill homeless people, she said, Dad, you have no idea what you're talking about. Because he was saying, I didn't realize how neurotic, and he had come out of that world of psychoanalytic language and thinking where everything is on a continuum, how neurotic people with schizophrenia could be. And she said, Dad, you have no idea what you're talking about. And so they simply didn't.
Meaning that it's not that they didn't take him seriously, they didn't understand the consequences of someone suffering through those delusions. That this is not just merely an anecdote, an interesting story, but that we're really dealing with a very sick person. And we have no idea what could happen, since we're in custody, we're custodians of a very sick person. And it's not because he comes in and entertains us with these very interesting delusions, but that maybe there's something we're missing that through our good intentions, that we don't anticipate that might happen.
Yes. Which doesn't mean, of course, that stigma isn't real, and it doesn't mean it isn't terrible.
But does it mean though, I'm sorry, does it mean that in your mind, he shouldn't have been at Yale Law School?
Well, I don't know how to answer that except to say two things. One is the doctors who recommended that he work at something that they considered mentally untaxing when he was still in a halfway house was not a permanent sentence to do something beneath him. But he always told, because he had already gotten into Yale Law School, which he had applied to before his psychotic break. But he would always say, why would I bag groceries or work at Macy's if I could be a Yale law professor? But one of his professors said to me, and one who was a very good mentor to him and kind, said to me, I never thought he would become a Yale law professor because he couldn't do the work. I thought he would be someone who had been to Yale Law School and could then be an advocate for people with schizophrenia.
Right.
So here's Michael saying, why would I do this when I could be a Yale lawyer? That was the phrase. Being a Yale lawyer was why he went there. And the people accommodating him didn't share with him their sense that he actually could not. And so their accommodation of him, which was an act of kindness, was actually creating a gap between reality and his perception of it that wasn't the product of his illness. It was the product of an accommodation that almost seemed to believe that if we act like it's so, it will become so.
And also,
at what point would he notice, you know?
And also, Michael, in this sense, this kid was always the golden boy. So he would never think that I couldn't become what I want to become, right? And why would he not think that he was limited by his disease?
Yes.
The professors might think he's limited, but he wouldn't. But this makes me think of something else I really want to talk about. Because both of you wanted the same career path as writers. Seems to me, Jonathan, there are two major breakdowns of your childhood friend, and they're both related to failures about writing. They're both interestingly related. The actual mental breakdowns, the first was Michael Lauder, who it always is the best of the best, is being rejected for every short story that he writes. He's plastering his walls with rejections. And that in the aftermath of that, there's a breakdown. And the second one that ultimately leads to the death of his fiance is that he can't seem to write the book he was paid $600,000 to write for the same reason he couldn't do the work at Yale. And so when you use the word stressors, you know, I wonder whether that's the idea, which was that maybe Macy's was the better job, that putting this kind of pressure on an unmedicated man is going to lead to unbelievable stress and delusions.
Well, when he was medicated, he still wasn't able, presumably, to do the work, but people genuinely didn't know he was ill. But it is the case that it would have been much better and for him to be in a low stress place initially. Ironically, in a sense, Yale was as close to an old-fashioned asylum as he could get. It was a walled community with a green interior. He said as much in the Times, which was a very interesting way of putting it. He said it's the most, it's the best mental health care facility in the country. But the implication there, of course, is that everybody is in the same situation, but there was no place for him to go, really. And that's part of the problem also. But it is the case that destigmatization is also something that can only come by acknowledging the reality of his illness. I mean, it was an enormous advance, the very enlightenment that for Foucault is the nightmare period, that you, instead of being seen as demonically possessed, or instead of your illness being judged a character flaw, you're seen as someone who has an illness, like diabetes, like any other illness for which actually there are very successful, no, not cures, but treatments, not for everyone. Some people are resistant to the medication, and that it's unpleasant, I well believe. It's just that it's the fear that even acknowledging that it is in fact something other than the same as everything is part of the problem I kept discovering and encountering. We live in a culture where discrimination used to have two kinds of meanings: to make a distinction, and to make a distinction and use that distinction to demean or oppress somebody. But now even making the distinction is often seen, or people fear that it might imply that they are doing something inappropriate, whereas life is all about the distinctions, and they're not permanent distinctions. When I take this, I am this way. Later, I might not need to do that, but people were busy making blanket statements, and that also did not in the end help him in any way.
So in reading your book on the public policy piece, because all of us are now concerned when we were talking about gun control, school shootings, this issue, this book is very timely because it forces us to take a real hard look at mental illness and what we should do about it. So for instance, there's a community of the psychoanalysts of Westchester who were his friends, a community, and they believed that the asylums, the mental institutions were bad, and that they believed that they should be deinstitutionalized. And in the end, these community health centers either didn't materialize or didn't work. But I wonder whether you're of two minds. There's a conflict, they're in tension. On the one hand, you want people to experience the freedom, human autonomy, not to be put away for life in an institution. You want to give them a choice. But if you give them the choice, they may be a danger to society. Similarly, if you give people the choice to medicate or not medicate, they may be a danger to society. So what in your mind, frankly, Jonathan, I think you should testify in front of Congress after writing this book. I think you'd have some interesting things to say. So why don't you tell us, what would you say to Congress? Mr. Rosen, your book has a lot of interesting ideas, but what would you say? Should we make more hospitals? Should we get more beds? Should we hire more psychiatrists? Should we make it so that we can require people to stay in the hospital even against their will? Should we force them to take meds?
Well, those are all the right questions, but they're not, again, blanket statements. It's really important to know that there's a there's a small percentage of people with severe mental illnesses. And of that percentage, there's a sub-fraction of people who do not think of themselves as ill as a symptom of their illness, are unresponsive to medication, or refuse to take it. So it's important not to think that there's a grand group of people. Within all of that, there are people far better schooled in this than I am. To speak, yes, there need to be more hospital beds. Medicaid perversely doesn't cover people in state long-term care psychiatric hospitals. In other words,
so I'm sorry. So
if you're in a state hospital or a long-term care,
regardless of your age and you don't get, that's not covered.
Right. But and everyone understands that needs to be fixed. But there was a time, this is again, a little piece of history, but one worth knowing. State hospitals had grown into a terrible state. They were overcrowded, understaffed. Medication did come along in the 50s, but the people who dreamed of community psychiatry wanted it to be federally funded. The states had been helping and caring for people with psychiatric disorders for over 100 years. But the temptation, and these were psychoanalysts, not people who worked with the severely ill, to turn state hospitals into the Bastille that had to be torn down rather than preserved and reformed, is part of the problem. They would have become much smaller. They were already becoming much smaller. When Ronald Reagan, who vowed to shut down all the state hospitals in California, became governor in '68, they were half empty already. And so in a way, there was an organic movement, but the fantasy that this would be a whole new project. You start with the year zero, and the year zero were community mental health centers, but they were not catering to everyone, was an aspect of the problem. And the thing that brought this home to me was reading a memoir by he was then a young psychologist who ran the community mental health program in Baltimore, in inner city Baltimore, and they were very idealistic. They thought mental illness was caused by poverty, by marginalization, by oppression, by racism, and they had only a handful of beds, and all their efforts, they thought, should go to helping ordinary people living under hard urban conditions. but there were people just as oppressed and just as marginalized who had the misfortune of having a son or a sister or a father who had a psychotic break. And what did they do? He says, well, we avoided that group, and the group released from hospitals, they called the cops. And so you see it being set up in this at that very moment, that idealistic moment. Being severely ill is being criminalized. And then they were taken, if they were lucky, first to jail, where you're living in terror because you're unmedicated and you have to sit for 24 hours. If you're lucky, you'll be admitted maybe to a state hospital. But the laws all changed because the civil liberties sort of mental illness bar, with also not knowing the reality of people who were severely ill, saw it only as a civil liberties issue and slammed the door behind everyone. And so what has to be acknowledged is the nature of illness as it affects people who are too ill to care for themselves and don't know they're ill. The only thing I'd say is my friend had resources. If you look at this world and say, who is likely to have resources? And he killed someone he shouldn't have killed. Jordan Neely, someone we're all talking about, did not have resources in a sense, although he had the city's resources. And he was killed and shouldn't have been killed. And the whole that affected both of them is the same whole. And it is, if I give it, if you give it, when people used to ask me, what's your policy recommendation? It was like what Solzhenitsyn said, don't lie. Don't pretend it's something it isn't as a way of imagining you can alter the reality and spare people's feelings. Have a conversation. Don't tell people what it is, but be open to the possibility that there are terrible illnesses for which there may be remedies. And the more we talk about it, we hope the better they'll be. But start that way, because otherwise, if you say, as Thomas Zaz, the anti-psychiatrist, said when I was an undergraduate and a woman froze to death in a box, it would have been cruel to bring her to the hospital because mental illness is a myth. And he defended her right to die there because he felt he was defending his own civil liberties. That was actually exploiting someone who did not know what she was doing, as her daughter came forward and spoke about. And she could have been helped and wasn't. And so it's only callousness. To make a virtue of it is worse. Stepping over the person is one thing, bad enough. But to pretend that it's an exalted state or a choice when it isn't is to invert reality. And that, I think, is a dreadful thing. So start that way. That's all I'd say. And then get people, and I can tell you who they are, who do know what policies need to be changed. We have to spend more money on fewer people.
But your book does such a wonderful job of identifying different categories of where the same conclusion is being made, that we shouldn't be interfering with someone's personal freedom, that mental illness is not really, it doesn't really exist, right? People who ignore the problem and don't understand the magnitude of the suffering and the illness itself. It is just an endless parade in the book of seeing what you just described about.
When I visited Michael in a locked ward, and I was a graduate student, I knew the second I saw him that he was not suffering from a socially constructed disorder, that he had an illness, and that is a piece of it. And I also knew, or feared, and now I really know, that people who thought they were honoring his autonomy were in fact denying it. And his roommate in college, a wonderful guy who died young before I could talk to him, left 3 young children, on his deathbed, wept for Carrie and said, all we did was worry that Michael was being treated fairly and being given his due, and we forgot about her. And I didn't want to forget about her in the book, and I worked very hard to make her present because there are real consequences to everyone's choices. And they're good intentions. Not all good intentions are bad, but the ones built on hopeful fantasies are.
There's a revelation in the book toward the end, and it made me also wonder whether it was also part of the impulse in writing it, which is that you're not a doctor, you're not you're just this was your friend, your childhood friend. And apparently you did speak to him a few days before he killed Carrie. And this happened with a number of other people where he just said something, intimated something, or gave someone a look. And people just got a sense, a shudder, a feeling. That was the policewoman in Cornell, in Ithaca. They got a sense that something is not right. And maybe you can just, tell us what Michael said on that last call.
Well, it was a couple of weeks before he killed Carrie, and we talked periodically. We had sometimes we would agree to get together, but we didn't. And I probably half hoped, or more than half hoped, we wouldn't. But we were talking, and suddenly, abruptly, he said, I have to go now. I'm having thoughts I shouldn't be having. And so I got off the phone and I put it out of my mind. And I am ashamed of that, of course. What would I have done? Would I have run, because in fact, a crisis intervention team the week before he killed Carrie had come to the door, and Michael had answered the door and taken the card and thanked them and sent them on their way and said he would call. But
because he was he was charismatic and convincing, and Correct. It was very hard to know that you're not in the presence of a very sick man.
But I'm ashamed in front of myself for having accepted something that was not right. And when I actually spoke about it at the talk I gave at the Jewish Museum, someone came up to me who said she had the exact same experience, right, as well. She was friends with his family, and she had spoken to him, and she felt, why didn't I do something? Many people, the world of aftermath is very different from the world of before.
Before we say goodnight to the audience, his editor had also the same experience. He apparently took a train up to see him. And then at some point, Michael just said, it's time for you to go. And the mood changed, everything changed. And there became a moment where the editor felt fearful that this was a different guy who opened the door and welcomed me in from the guy I'm about to leave. Before we say goodnight to Jonathan Rosen, I think we've got a couple just quick announcements. We've got an upcoming event. Of course, go to the chat box so you can get the link to buy it. As I said, should be your summer read. It's a phenomenal book. And as I said, it's a book that covers so much territory and it's told in such an engaging, compelling, compulsive read. Don't miss this book for the summer. We have an upcoming event. There we go. Our annual Law of the Land at 92nd Street Y, where we go over in a most, with civilians, we basically go over the big cases of the Supreme Court for the year. It tends to be one of the more popular things that we do. And we have journalists. You can see in the middle, there's Adam Liptak from the New York Times. On the far right is Dahlia Lithwick from Slate. And it's sort of a raucous hour of talking about what the Supreme Court did. If you haven't signed up yet for receiving information about FOLCS, please go to folks.org and sign up for email lists. And of course, if you enjoyed tonight, and all of our other programs, we'd always want you to be among your favorite charities. Jonathan, we've been friends for a very long time. I think it's important that I point out for anyone watching who thinks that I have any value as a nonfiction writer of essays and reviews, this man discovered me. I wrote my very first book review for Jonathan. And I remembered when he assigned it to me, how excited I was. And I was especially excited when I finished my first assignment. I was already in my 30s. I wasn't a kid. And I'll never forget coming home and playing the answering machine where Jonathan said, I really like what you wrote, and I hope you'll keep writing for us. And Jonathan, I cannot tell you how important that was at that time. And I tell people all the time, you got me started as a nonfiction writer, and I'm very beholden to you. Your words of encouragement, you were always a great writer, a terrific editor and friend, but I trusted you. If you wanted me to keep doing it, maybe I should have left that Wall Street law firm and continue to be writing. So thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much for having me and circling back to that time and to being here with me now. I'm really grateful.
Jonathan, I was very touched by this book. I felt like I knew you more and better in different ways. It's a very revealing, very brave book, and I hope people will read it and talk about it because they should. Jonathan, good luck on the book tour. I'm Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS. Until next time, good night.
Thank you. Good night.